The big stick policy is, however, strongly backed by the leader of the Nationals, David Littleproud, who says it's in Australia's best interest to protect supermarket suppliers. I spoke to him about the proposed policy and the new laws banning live sheep exports a short time ago.
Yeah, well, it is natural coalition policy. In fact, we were the ones that brought in divestiture powers for the energy sector in 2019. And in fact, Anthony Albanese and the Labor Party supported us in that move in 2019. But we've seen evidence in the supermarket sector, not just at the farm gate, but for consumers over the last 12 to 18 months, that shows that they don't respect the current regulatory guide rails, but particularly the penalties that are in place, because what we're saying is we're not moving or increasing the regulatory burden on them, therefore any cost. What we're saying is the penalties should be higher. So the codes of conduct will be respected and mandated, but under the Consumer and Competition Act, we'll be relying on Section 46 in an egregious case for a court to determine whether divestiture is an appropriate penalty, but there needs to be a scaling up penalty, and that starts with the codes in terms of infringement notices. And what the Labor Party have put in place is a maximum infringement notice of $186,700. They'll pull that out of a till in Sydney or Melbourne to pay for that. That's just the cost of doing business. Ours goes up to $2 million. We do support what Dr. Emerson has put in place in terms of higher penalties beyond that, determined at $10 million or 10% of the turnover. But we believe the divestiture penalty with safeguards around making sure that it can only be approved by a court if it will increase competition and there are no job losses. So we've put safeguards to make sure that this is a deterrent, a big deterrent to change the culture of the supermarkets, and we're instituting a supermarket commissioner as a free point of arbitration and conciliation between a farmer and the supermarket that they can either do directly or they can do confidentially and have escalated to the ACCC for investigation so they don't have to fear retribution. This is sound policy, respecting existing structures so there's no increase in costs to the supermarkets that they can't claim will be passed on to you. But if they do the wrong thing, there's a deterrent there to make sure there's fair, transparent prices from the farm gate to your plate.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because it's not often the Greens will side with a coalition proposal, but do you think supermarket pricing and the supermarket's influence over farmers and producers has just got totally out of control?
Yeah, and we heard evidence of that. And in fact, we've asked for the government to bring forward this statutory review that Emerson did 18 months ago because we could see the evidence. When you saw a 60% reduction in farm gate prices for sheep and cattle, but only an 8% reduction at the checkout, something was going on. And then when you hear that farmers are pushing out permanent plantings of trees, cherry trees, 50 acres of cherry tree, a farmer in Orange bulldozed in because he sent a B-double load of cherries, tens of thousands of pieces of fruit, because they had a couple of blemishes on them. Instead of getting the $95,000 that they were owed, they would only give them $5,000, and they knew that it was a perishable commodity, knew that they had no other option, so the farmer just had to suck it up and then decided to push their trees over. We all lose if there's not fairness and transparency in our supply chains. No one's trying to fix prices. They just want fair prices that consumers can see through the supply chain and are paying at appropriate levels.
Yeah, another big issue this week has been the sheep live export bill passing through the Senate, exports to be phased out by 2028. Farming sector's obviously unhappy. Do you think it could have implications for the next federal election in Western Australia?
I will. And in fact, the Keep the Sheep movement have over 60,000 signatories to their petition. They've got over 4,000 volunteers that are door knocking over this weekend to start, making sure every Labor seat knows what they are doing to Western Australians. There's no economic or scientific reason to do this. In fact, what you're going to see is the perverse and horrific death of millions of sheep from other countries that'll take our market up because we've cut and run. They don't have the animal welfare standards in stocking density rates that we do. They get paid by just putting as many sheep as they possibly can on boats and getting paid for what's left at the other end. These animal activists are morally bankrupt. They're valuing the welfare of sheep in Australia over that from another part of the world. This is a trade that will continue in the Middle East because it's cultural, but it's also about their food security. We want fresh meat, so do they. And they'll continue to get it, but not from us. And I fear that this will now have contagion into live cattle, which will decimate Australian agriculture agriculture, and Western Australians are upset. I can tell you they're ready to, with baseball bats, for the Albanese government at the next election.
Yeah, how quickly, though, could a WA sheep farmer potentially pivot from exporting live sheep to exporting sheep meat? Do you reckon that's achievable by 2028?
Well, not from WA, and this is where there's a lack of understanding of production cycles in Western Australia. It's a very cyclical industry, and so what it would mean is to go and build another abattoir to take that capacity up. You still wouldn't get it running at 365 days a year. It costs you $50 million plus to build a plant, and then you've got to find the staff and keep the staff for 12 months, even though you only got work for 6 to 9 months. So the economics aren't there. And then if you want to bring it east, there's the Nullarbor, and the transport costs are just too high. So this is already having devastating impacts where farmers, the price has dropped to $10, $20 a head over in Western Australia, and some farmers are choosing, because they can't afford to send them to market, simply shooting them in the paddock. And that's all at the feet of these animal activists, RSPCA, and that's the sort of animal welfare outcomes that happen. So unfortunately, it's not as simple as thinking you can just process it and send it. Agriculture is a little bit more complicated than that, and this government hasn't appreciated that. But we've also been disrespectful to our trading partners in the Middle East, who will now have to go to other parts of the world to get their food security.
The government have also introduced the first tranche of the Future Made in Australia legislation into Parliament this week. I've got the Productivity Commission coming up on the show soon, but they've said previously that the Future Made in Australia Act could be seen as protectionism in some ways. What do you make of that?
Yeah, look, we're going to look through the bill closely and obviously take it to Shadow Cabinet before we make a final determination on it. But it is important that we get the fundamentals right around manufacturing. You just can't keep subsidising it, because ultimately Australian taxpayers' money runs out. What you've got to do is set the fundamentals. And the fundamentals is baseload reliable power that can be put on 24/7 to keep manufacturers going, not an all renewables approach. And you have to have sensible industrial relations policy that improves productivity, not just improves wages. You've got to try and achieve both, and unfortunately we don't have that at the moment. And this government's spending $45 million on an advertising campaign for this in a cost of living crisis. I would have thought if the policy's so good, you wouldn't have to run ads around the country on it. So we'll be mature about this. We'll look through the legislation, but I do get concerned about us continuing to try and keep manufacturing going with just subsidies rather than tackling the root cause of why it's leaving this country, which is baseload power that's reliable and affordable, as well as proper industrial relations policy.
Yeah, you mentioned baseload power. There's obviously been a lot of headlines in recent weeks about nuclear and the proposal to build 7 reactors. Do you think sentiment at all has shifted over the past few weeks since the first announcement came out?
Yeah, I think it has, and we've seen that in polling, but we're not taking that for granted. We're taking this slowly and in bite sizes, and so the next announcements will be around the costs. We've said that Australians will own these, and we've been upfront with those communities, and the communities overwhelmingly support this because they don't want a future in regional Australia littered with transmission lines, wind turbines and solar panels. They want a sensible energy policy that gives us baseload power that underpins manufacturing. So next stage is not only address the costings, but we'll also be upfront about the mix. There will be a transition from some of our coal into nuclear plants, along with gas and carbon capture storage, and there still will be renewables. We'll have a mixture, and that's what most industrial countries around the world have done. If you look at Japan in particular, they're reopening their nuclear power plants, building a new one, taking Australian gas, storing their carbon back here in Australia, which we get paid for, and they're still having renewables. So we just want to get that mix right and the balance right about bringing energy security to our country, but giving sovereign capability to our manufacturing into the future.
David Littleproud, Leader of the National Party, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.